Important, the village of Briarwood was the sort of place where nothing truly unexpected was supposed to happen. Its hedges were clipped with quiet regularity, its lanes curved in gentle agreement with the land, and its inhabitants maintained that delicate balance between interest and discretion, which allowed everything to be known without anything being openly said. At the far end of the village, beyond a narrow lane lined with hawthorn, stood Briarwood Lodge. It was not a large house, but it possessed a certain dignity that came from age rather than grandeur. Its brickwork had darkened with time, ivy traced careful patterns along its walls, and its window stall, narrow and slightly recessed, gave the impression of watching rather than merely admitting light. Those who passed along the lane often remarked, though not to one another, that the house seemed aware. On the afternoon of the village summer tea, Briarwood Lodge had opened its gates. Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt, its owner, had extended invitations with a precision that suggested both generosity and intention. She was a woman in her early 60s, upright in posture, exact in speech, and possessed of that particular kind of composure which does not invite contradiction. Having returned to Briarwood after many years abroad, she had re-established herself with quiet efficiency, restoring the lodge and, it seemed, arranging the village around it once more. Miss Marple sat beneath a striped umbrella on the lawn, a cup of tea resting lightly in her hand. She had accepted the invitation with pleasure, though not without curiosity. One did not, she thought, return to a village after 20 years without bringing something with one, if not in luggage, then in memory. Important. Around her the gathering had arranged itself into its natural formations. Colonel Everett Langley stood near the rose border, speaking with a firm certainty that discouraged interruption. Mrs. Phelps, who managed the village post office and a great deal besides, hovered near the tea table, distributing both cups and information in equal measure. Dr. Simon read. The local physician moved quietly among the guests, his manner attentive but reserved. Closer to the house stood Mr. Adrian Blake. He had arrived only recently, taking up temporary residence at the lodge as Mrs. Harcourt's guest. He was a man of middle years, well-dressed, with an ease of manner that suggested familiarity with many places and a permanent attachment to none. He spoke easily, laughed at the right moments, and yet Miss Marple noticed that his eyes were rarely still. Near him stood Clara Whitby, a distant relation of Mrs. Harcourt, who had come to assist during the season. She was younger, quieter, and watched the proceedings with a thoughtful seriousness that did not entirely suit the occasion. Miss Marple observed them all with gentle interest. It was not, she reflected, an unusual gathering, but there was something beneath a slight tension, like a thread drawn too tightly through fabric. Mrs. Harcourt moved among her guests with composed assurance. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, pausing beside her, "I hope you are comfortable." "Very much so," Miss Marple replied. "It is a lovely afternoon." "Yes," said Mrs. Harcourt. "We have been fortunate." There was a pause. "Briarwood has changed very little," Miss Marple added. "No," said Mrs. Harcourt. "It does not." The tone was neutral, but there was something in it that suggested the past was not entirely at rest. "Important." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "that is often the case." A slight breeze moved across the lawn, stirring the leaves and carrying with it the faint scent of roses. For a moment the scene was entirely peaceful. Then, quite suddenly, it shifted. It began with a sound. Not loud, not dramatic, merely the sharp closing of a door somewhere within the house. It was followed, a moment later, by the unmistakable sound of something falling. The conversations on the lawn faltered. Mrs. Harcourt turned her head toward the house. "That is odd," she said. Before anyone could respond, Clara Whitby moved quickly toward the open terrace doors. "I will see," she said. She disappeared inside. There was a brief silence. Then a cry. It was not prolonged, but it carried clearly across the lawn, a single sharp exclamation that broke off abruptly, as though the speaker had been prevented from continuing. Miss Marple set down her cup. Around her the guests were already rising, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to alarm. Colonel Langley moved first, followed by Dr. Reed. Mrs. Phelps hesitated only long enough to set down the teapot before hurrying after them. Mrs. Harcourt did not move at once. She stood very still, her gaze fixed on the open doors, her expression unreadable. Then she said, very quietly, that should not have happened. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her for a moment. Then she rose, because she knew with that quiet certainty that came from long experience that whatever had just occurred inside Briarwood Lodge had not been an accident, and that, before the afternoon was over, the village would have something new to know and something far more troubling to understand. Important. The movement toward the house was swift but not chaotic. Colonel Langley reached the terrace first, pushing the door wide with a decisive hand, while Dr. Reed followed closely behind. The others came more cautiously, drawn by urgency but checked by uncertainty. Miss Marple arrived among the last, her pace unhurried, her eyes already attentive to details others had not yet begun to notice. Inside, the air felt different. The drawing room, which had been arranged for quiet comfort, now held a strained stillness, as though something within it had disrupted the natural order. One of the chairs near the writing desk had been pushed back at an angle, and a small table beside it had been knocked slightly askew. A porcelain figurine lay on its side upon the carpet, unbroken but displaced. Clara Whitby stood near the center of the room. She had not moved since the others entered. Her face was pale, her hands held tightly together before her, and her gaze fixed upon the floor. At her feet lay Mr. Adrian Blake. He was on his back, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, the other stretched outward as though reaching for balance that had not come in time. His expression was not one of pain, but of surprise, sharp, incomplete, as though whatever had overtaken him had done so too quickly for comprehension. Dr. Reed knelt at once, his manner calm but intent. "Please stand back," he said. Colonel Langley obeyed immediately, though not without a glance that suggested he would have preferred to remain closer. Mrs. Phelps hovered in the doorway, her hand pressed against her chest. Mrs. Harcourt entered more slowly than the others, her composure intact but her eyes fixed unwaveringly on the figure on the floor. Important. Miss Marple stood just inside the room, her attention moving quietly from one point to another. The desk, the chair, the fallen figurine, and then very briefly the window. Dr. Reed touched Blake's wrist, then his throat. His fingers remained there for a moment longer than necessary, as though confirming something that required certainty rather than speed. Then he rose. "He is dead," he said. The words seemed to settle heavily into the room. Mrs. Phelps gave a soft exclamation. Colonel Langley drew in a sharp breath. Clara Whitby did not move. Mrs. Harcourt spoke. "How?" she said. Dr. Reed shook his head slightly. "I cannot say at once," he replied. "There are no visible injuries. It may have been sudden, very sudden." Miss Marple looked at Clara. "You found him, my dear?" she asked gently. Clara nodded. "I came in when I heard the noise," she said. "He was already on the floor. Did you see anyone else?" "No." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed the tightness in her hands. Colonel Langley spoke. "There must have been someone," he said. "A man does not simply fall like that without cause." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "not without cause." Her eyes moved again to the room. Something was wrong. Not in the obvious sense that was clear enough, but in a quieter, more particular way. Dr. Reed stepped back. "We must send it to the police," he said. Mrs. Harcourt inclined her head. "Yes." Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath each tension that did not come from shock alone. Miss Marple watched her. It was the way she stood, she thought. Too still, as though she were holding something in place. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the desk. A single sheet of paper lay upon it, blank. Or nearly so. She stepped a little closer. It was not entirely blank. Important. There was an indentation, faint, but visible in the right light, as though something had been written upon a sheet above it, and the pressure of the pen had marked the page beneath. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. That, she thought, was interesting. Very interesting indeed. Behind her, Mrs. Phelps spoke again. "He was speaking only moments ago," she said. "Laughing, even." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "That is often how it is." Her gaze remained on the paper. Because whatever had been written there had been written recently, and had been removed. She straightened slowly. Yes, something had been said in this room, something that mattered, and someone had taken care to ensure that it could not be read. Important. Inspector Warren arrived with the measured promptness of a man accustomed to disturbances that rarely improved upon closer inspection. He was not tall, but he possessed a solid presence, and his eyes, steady and unhurried, took in the room at a glance before settling on the figure upon the floor. "Dr. Reed," he said. "Dead," the doctor replied, suddenly, no obvious cause. Inspector Warren nodded once, then turned his attention outward, as though the body, though central, was only one part of a larger arrangement. "No one leaves the house for the present," he said quietly. "I shall need to speak with each of you." There was a murmur of assent, though not without unease. Miss Marple remained near the desk, her gaze resting lightly on the faintly marked sheet of paper. She did not touch it. It was often better, she thought, to leave things exactly as they were, at least until one understood what they meant. Inspector Warren approached Clara Whitby first. "You found him?" "Yes." "At what time?" "I am not certain. Only a few minutes after I left the lawn." "Why did you leave the lawn?" Clara hesitated. "I heard something," she said. "A door, perhaps." It seemed unusual. Inspector Warren inclined his head. "And when you entered, he was already there." "I saw no one else." "Did you touch anything?" "No." Her answers were careful, but Miss Marple noticed the slight delay before each one, as though Clara were measuring not merely truth but its effect. Inspector Warren turned to Colonel Langley. "You were outside?" "Yes." "Did you see anyone enter or leave the house?" "No one." "Are you certain?" "Kitty." The Colonel's tone was firm, but Miss Marple observed that he had not specified which entrance he had been watching. Inspector Warren moved on. "Mrs. to Naracourt." She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." "You were hosting the gathering?" "Yes." "And Mr. Blake?" "A guest. How well did you know him?" "Not well," she said. "He was recommended to me." "By whom?" There was a pause. "A mutual acquaintance." Inspector Warren waited, but she did not elaborate. Miss Marple thought that her mission was deliberate. Inspector Warren turned slightly. "Mrs. Phelps." "Oh, I know nothing at all," she said at once. "I was pouring tea. I did not leave the table until I cried." Inspector Warren nodded. "And you, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently. "I was sitting under the umbrella," she said, "observing." "And what did you observe?" Miss Marple considered. "That Mr. Blake was a man who looked about him a great deal," she said, "as though he expected to see something or someone." Inspector Warren's eyes sharpened. "Did he?" "I think," she said, "that he believed he would." There was a pause. Inspector Warren glanced toward the desk. "You have noticed something," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Only a small thing," she replied. "The paper." He stepped closer. "Yes?" "It has been written upon," she said, "not directly, but through pressure from another sheet." Inspector Warren bent slightly, examining it. "I see," he said. "The writing itself is gone," Miss Marple continued, "which suggests it was removed. By whom?" "That," she said gently, "is the question." Inspector Warren straightened. "And you think it matters?" "I think it matters very much." There was silence. Inspector Warren looked around the room again, more slowly this time. "A man is dead," he said. "A message has been written and removed, and no one has seen anything." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No one ever does," she said. "At first. Important." Inspector Warren regarded her thoughtfully. "And later?" "Later," she said, "they remember exactly what is necessary." Her gaze moved quietly across the faces in the room, each one composed, each one holding something back. Yes, she thought, the message had been written, and someone had not wished it to remain. Important. Inspector Warren did not immediately question anyone further. Instead, he walked slowly around the room, as though acquainting himself not merely with the physical arrangement, but with the invisible pattern that lay beneath it. His eyes lingered on the desk again, then moved to the window and finally to the terrace doors through which the summer light continued to fall, indifferent to what had occurred. Miss Marple remained where she was, her attention still resting lightly on the paper. It was such a small thing, And yet, she thought, small things were rarely accidental. Inspector Warren spoke at last. "This message," he said, "whatever it contained, it was important enough to be removed at once." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "And written just before the incident." "I think so." He nodded. "Then we must ask, who was it written for?" There was a pause. Colonel Langley spoke. "For the man himself, perhaps," he said. "A note, a reminder." Inspector Warren shook his head slightly. If that were the case, there would be no reason to remove it. Miss Marple inclined her head. "No," she said. "It was written for someone else." Clara Whitby looked up. "You mean it was a message to someone?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. Her tone was mild, but her eyes were attentive. Inspector Warren considered this. "Then the person it was intended for must have seen it," he said. "Yes." "And removed it?" "Yes." There was silence. Mrs. Harcourt spoke. "This is all conjecture," she said. "We do not even know what was written." "No," said Miss Marple, "but we may know why it was written." Inspector Warren turned to her. "And why was that?" She folded her hands. "Because Mr. Blake was not at ease," she said. "He was watching, waiting. That suggests expectation. Important. And when people expect something, they sometimes prepare for it." Inspector Warren nodded slowly. "Prepare how?" "By leaving a record," she said. "In case something happens." There was a pause. Dr. Reed spoke quietly. "You think he anticipated danger?" "I think he anticipated an encounter," Miss Marple replied. "Whether he expected danger from it, I cannot say, but he wished to leave something behind." Inspector Warren's gaze sharpened, and someone ensured that he did not. "Yes." There was another silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved once more across the room. Colonel Langley stood firm, but his attention had shifted inward, as though reconsidering something. Mrs. Harcourt remained composed, though her stillness had deepened. Clara Whitby sat quietly, her expression thoughtful but guarded. Mrs. Phelps lingered at the doorway, her curiosity barely contained. Each of them, Miss Marple thought, had heard the same words. But not all of them had reacted in the same way. Inspector Warren spoke again. "Miss Whitby," he said, "you said you heard a sound before entering." "Yes." "What kind of sound?" "A door," she said. "Closing, I think." "From which direction?" Clara hesitated. "I am not certain." Inspector Warren regarded her. "Not certain?" "No." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "It is difficult," she said, "to remember sounds precisely when one is startled." Clara nodded quickly. "Yes," Inspector Warren said, "and you saw no one leaving?" "No." There was a pause. Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the window. It was closed. That, in itself, was not unusual. But the curtain very slightly disturbed suggested that it had not always been so. She stepped a little closer. "Inspector," she said softly. "May I?" He inclined his head. "Of course. Important." She reached out and touched the curtain lightly. "It has been moved," she said. Inspector Warren stepped nearer. "The window?" "Yes." He examined it. "It is latched." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Now." There was a pause. Inspector Warren looked at her. "You think it was opened?" "I think," she said gently, "that it may have been." He turned back to the room. "Then we must consider another possibility," he said. "That someone left by this way." Colonel Langley frowned. "That seems unlikely." "Does it?" said Miss Marple softly. Her eyes moved once more across the room. Yes, she thought. The message had been written. The paper had been removed. And now there was a way out, which meant only one thing. Someone had not only known what was written, but had been prepared to act the moment it appeared. Important. Inspector Warren did not dismiss the possibility of the window at once, though he did not fully accept it either. He examined the latch more closely, then the sill beneath it, running his fingers lightly along the wood as though expecting to find some trace that might confirm or deny Miss Marple's quiet suggestion. "There are no marks," he said at last. "No sign of disturbance outside." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but not all movements leave marks." Inspector Warren straightened. "That is true." He turned back to the room. If someone left this way, they would have needed both opportunity and speed. The interval was very short. Yes, said Miss Marple, but not impossible. Dr. Reed spoke. Would it not be simpler, he said, to assume that the paper was taken by someone already present? Someone who had no need to leave at all? Inspector Warren nodded. That is in fact the more likely explanation. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, it often is. Her eyes moved gently across the group. Opportunity, she thought, was rarely lacking, but understanding it required care. Inspector Warren addressed them all. I will need a clear account of each person's movements, he said. From the moment the disturbance was heard, there was a murmur of assent. Colonel Langley spoke first. I remained on the lawn, he said, until Miss Whitby cried out. Then I came in at once. And you saw no one leave the house? No. Inspector Warren turned to Mrs. Phelps. I was at the tea table, she said. I heard the noise and then the cry. I did not move until others had gone inside. Did you see anyone approach the house? No. Inspector Warren nodded and looked to Dr. Reed. I was speaking with Mrs. Harcourt, the doctor said. We both heard the sound. Important. I came in immediately afterward. Mrs. Harcourt inclined her head. That is correct. Inspector Warren studied her for a moment. And before that? I was with my guests, she said. As you saw. Her tone was composed, but Miss Marple noticed that she did not elaborate. Inspector Warren turned to Clara. You were the first inside, he said. Yes. And you saw no one else? No. There was a pause. Miss Marple spoke softly. It is curious, she said. Inspector Warren looked at her. Yes. That no one saw anyone enter, she continued, and no one saw anyone leave. Inspector Warren considered. You think the person was already here? I think it is very likely. There was silence. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more to the desk, then to the chair, then very briefly to the position of the body. A small detail caught her attention. She stepped forward slightly. The chair, she said. Inspector Warren followed her gaze. What of it? It is not quite where one would expect, she said. He looked more closely. The chair had been pushed back, but not directly away from the desk. It stood at a slight angle, as though someone had risen quicklebutt, not from directly facing the writing surface. Inspector Warren frowned. You think he was not seated properly? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that he may have turned. Turned? Turned? Yes, she indicated the angle. As though responding to someone beside him, she said. There was a pause. Inspector Warren nodded slowly. Then he was not alone when the message was written. No. And the other person was close. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands. Close enough to read what was written, she added. The words settled quietly. Inspector Warren looked around the room again. Important. If that is so, he said, then the message was seen the moment it was completed. Yes. And taken immediately. Yes. There was silence. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Clara Whitby, then on Mrs. Harcourt. Each, she thought, had been near enough. Each had had the opportunity, but only one had shown the particular kind of stillness that followed recognition. She said nothing, but in her mind the pattern had begun to form more clearly. The message had been written, the message had been read, and someone had understood it far too well. Important. Inspector Warren did not immediately draw conclusions from the position of the chair, but Miss Marple could see that the observation had taken root. He moved slightly to one side, positioning himself where Mr. Blake must have been seated, and looked out across the room. If he turned, the inspector said, then someone was standing here. He indicated a point just to the right of the desk. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. Inspector Warren stepped back and addressed the group again. Then we must consider who could have been in this position, he said. Close enough to speak with him, and close enough to read what he wrote. There was a pause. Colonel Langley spoke. That would require the person to have entered the room before the incident, he said, and remained unseen, or seen but not remarked upon, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Warren glanced at her. You think someone may have been present without drawing attention? Yes, she replied. It is surprisingly easy in a gathering to move from one place to another without being noticed, particularly if one appears to belong. There was silence. Dr. Reed nodded slightly. That is true. Inspector Warren turned to Clara again. When you entered, he said, did you look at the desk immediately? Clara hesitated. No, she said. I saw Mr. Blake first. And the desk? Only afterward. Inspector Warren studied her. And you noticed nothing unusual? No. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her gently. That, she thought, was not quite complete. Inspector Warren turned to Mrs. Harcourt. And you? She met his gaze. I entered after Colonel Langley, she said. My attention was on Mr. Blake. And you did not approach the desk? No. Inspector Warren nodded. Miss Marple spoke quietly. Important. It is often the case, she said, that what we do not approach is as significant as what we do. Inspector Warren looked at her. In what way? She smiled faintly. If something is of no importance to us, we do not avoid it, she said. We simply ignore it. There was a pause. Inspector Warren's gaze shifted briefly to Mrs. Harcourt. Then he said, Miss Marple, you believe the message was understood immediately? Yes. And that it caused a reaction? Yes. What sort of reaction? Miss Marple considered. Don't panic, she said. That leaves disorder, not confusion. That leaves delay. Something quicker than both. Inspector Warren nodded slowly. Decision. Yes. The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Inspector Warren looked again at the desk. Then the person who took the paper did so at once, he said. Without hesitation. Yes. And without fear of being seen. Miss Marple inclined her head. That is often the case when one believes one has the right to act. There was silence. Colonel Langley frowned. Right, he said, to remove evidence. Miss Marple smiled gently. People do not always think in terms of evidence, she said. They think in terms of necessity. Inspector Warren's expression sharpened. Necessity to conceal something. Or to prevent something, she said. There was a pause. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the room. Clara Whitby sat very still, her hands now clasped more tightly than before. Mrs. Harcourt remained composed, but there was a faint rigidity in her posture that had not been there earlier. Colonel Langley stood firm, but his attention had narrowed. Dr. Red watched thoughtfully. Each of them, she thought, had heard the same idea, but only one had reacted to it. Inspector Warren spoke again. Important. If the message was written as a precaution, he said, then Mr. Blake must have anticipated something. Yes. And the person with him knew that. Yes. Inspector Warren nodded. Then we are not dealing with chance, he said, but with expectation. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said softly. Her eyes moved briefly to Mrs. Harcourt, because expectation, she thought, was rarely shared equally. And in that room someone had known not only that the message would be written but what it would say. Important. Inspector Warren did not immediately pursue Miss Marple's last observation, but the word expectation had clearly taken hold. He turned away from the desk and walked slowly toward the terrace doors, pausing there as though considering the scene from another angle. If Mr. Blake expected something, he said, then he must have arranged to meet someone. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. And that person came. Yes, Inspector Warren turned back. And was known to him. I think so, she replied. He did not appear alarmedly attentive. Dr. Reed nodded slightly. That is consistent with what we observed outside, he said. He was watchful but not uneasy. Inspector Warren considered this. Then the meeting was anticipated, he said, and the message was written during it. Yes, Colonel Langley spoke. Then why write anything at all? He said. If he was speaking to the person directly, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because sometimes, she said, one wishes to leave a record of what is said, particularly if one is uncertain how matters will proceed. Inspector Warren's gaze sharpened. A safeguard, yes. There was a pause. Inspector Warren turned to Mrs. Harcourt. Did Mr. Blake receive any visitors before the gathering? He asked. She met his gaze calmly. Not to my knowledge. And during the afternoon? No. Miss Marple watched her. The answer, she thought, was careful. Inspector Warren continued. Was there any reason he might expect a particular person to come to him? Mrs. Harcourt hesitated, just slightly. I cannot say, she replied. Miss Marple folded her hands. It was a very small hesitation, but it was there. Inspector Warren turned to Clara. And you, Miss Whitby? Did Mr. Blake mention any appointment? Clara shook her head. No. Important. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed that she did not look at Mrs. Harcourt as she spoke. Inspector Warren stepped back toward the center of the room. Then we must consider another possibility, he said. That the meeting was not openly argued. Understood. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That is often the case. Colonel Langley frowned. You meant something agreed without being spoken? Yes, Miss Marple replied, or something long anticipated. There was silence. Inspector Warren spoke again. If that is so, he said, then the person who met him knew why they were there, and knew what might be said. Yes, and when the message was written they understood it at once, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Warren nodded slowly. And acted immediately. Yes. There was a pause. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the room. Clara Whitby remained very still, her hands now clasped so tightly that the knuckles had paled. Colonel Langley's attention had sharpened, though his expression remained controlled. Dr. Red watched quietly, his eyes thoughtful, and Mrs. Harcourt, she stood exactly as before, composed, unmoved. But Miss Marple noticed something else. She had not once asked what the message might have said. Not once. Miss Marple spoke gently. It is curious, she said. Inspector Warren looked at her. Yes? No one has asked about the content of the message, she said, only about its absence. There was a pause. Inspector Warren's expression changed slightly. That is true. Miss Marple inclined her head. One might expect curiosity, she continued, unless of course Corsione already has some idea of what it contained. The words settled quietly. Inspector Warren's gaze moved slowly to Mrs. Harcourt. She did not speak. Important. But for the first time Miss Marple saw it. Not fear, not surprising, but recognition. Very slight, very controlled, but unmistakable. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she thought, the message had been written. The message had been read, and someone in that room had not needed to ask what it said because they had already known. Important. Inspector Warren did not speak at once after Miss Marple's observation. He allowed the silence to settle, and in that silence the weight of her words seemed to take clearer shape. His gaze rested on Mrs. Harcourt, not accusingly, but with a quiet persistence that invited response. Mrs. Harcourt met it without flinching. I do not see why I should speculate about a message I have not read, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Quite so, she said gently. Speculation is rarely helpful. But curiosity is a natural thing. There are more pressing concerns, Mrs. Harcourt replied. A man has died. Yes, said Miss Marple. And it is often the smallest things that explain the largest ones. Inspector Warren stepped forward. Mrs. Harcourt, he said, did you speak with Mr. Blake before he came inside? Yes. About what? Nothing of consequence. Inspector Warren waited. Nothing at all? He asked. She paused. We spoke of the house, she said. And of the village. General matters. Miss Marple watched her closely. That, she thought, was not the whole of it. Inspector Warren nodded slowly. And you did not arrange to meet him inside? No. Did he ask to see you? No. The answers came evenly, too evenly. Miss Marple stepped slightly nearer the desk, her tone still mild. It is interesting, she said, how often people speak of general matters when something more particular is on their minds. Mrs. Harcourt turned to her. I do not understand you. Miss Marple smiled gently. No, she said. That is often the case. There was a pause. Inspector Warren spoke again. Mrs. Harcourt, you have lived here before, he said. Many years ago. Yes. And Mr. Blake, did you know him then? There was silence, very slight, but present. Mrs. Important. Harcourt's composure did not break, but something in her stillness deepened. No, she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. That, she thought, was not true. Inspector Warren did not immediately challenge the answer. Instead, he turned slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, "you believe the message was written for a reason, that it was understood immediately, and that prompted a decision." "Yes." "What sort of decision?" Miss Marple considered. "One made quickly," she said, "without hesitation, and with certainty that it must be done at once." Inspector Warren nodded. "And not by someone surprised?" "No." There was silence. Miss Marple's gaze moved again to Mrs. Harcourt. "Because surprise delays," she said softly, "but recognition does not." The words lingered. Inspector Warren turned back to Mrs. Harcourt. "When you entered the room," he said, "did you look at the desk?" "No." "And yet you knew nothing of what had been written?" "No." Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is a curious thing," she said, "how we sometimes avoid looking at something because we already know what we will see." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flickered. Only for a moment. But it was enough. Inspector Warren saw it. "So," he said quietly, "you did know." Mrs. Harcourt did not answer. The silence stretched. Then, very calmly, she said, "I knew what he might write." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said softly, "that is the same thing." Inspector Warren stepped closer. "Explain," he said. Mrs. Harcourt drew a breath. "He came here with a purpose," she said. "He wished to speak of the past, of things that were not meant to be revisited." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, and you knew this?" "Yes." "And you met him inside?" There was a pause. Then Mrs. Harcourt said, "Yes." Important, the admission was quiet, but it changed everything. Miss Marple folded her hands. Because now the meeting was no longer uncertain, the message was no longer accidental. And the person who had read it had not only understood it but had been part of it from the very beginning. Important. The admission settled over the room with quiet finality. No one spoke at once, but the effect was unmistakable. What had been uncertain now began to take form, and with it came a different kind of attention, sharper, more focused, less willing to accept appearances as they stood. Inspector Warren did not raise his voice. "You met him inside," he said. "Then you were the person standing beside him when the message was written." "Yes," Mrs. Harcourt replied. Her tone remained composed, but there was a new weight behind it, as though the effort of concealment had given way to something steadier. Inspector Warren nodded. "Tell me what happened." Mrs. Harcourt stood very still for a moment, her gaze resting not on the inspector, but on the desk. "He asked me to come in," she said. "He wished to speak privately." I agreed. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she murmured. Inspector Warren continued. "And the subject?" "The past," Mrs. Harcourt said. "Matters that had been settled, or so I believed." Miss Marple watched her quietly. "Such matters are rarely settled," she said gently. "No," Mrs. Harcourt replied. "They are not," Inspector Warren said. "And Mr. Blake, what did he want?" "To reveal something," she said. "Or to threaten to reveal it. I am not certain which." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes," she said. "It is often difficult to distinguish between the two." Inspector Warren's tone remained steady. "And the message?" "He began to write," Mrs. Harcourt said. "He said it was only a precaution, that if anything happened there would be a record." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." Inspector Warren stepped closer. "And you read it?" "Yes." "What did it say?" There was a pause. Mrs. Harcourt's composure faltered for the first time, though only slightly. "Important. It named me," she said. The silence deepened. Inspector Warren did not interrupt. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Yes," she said. "I thought it might." Inspector Warren said, "Named you in what way?" Mrs. Harcourt drew a breath. "As responsible," she said, "for something that occurred many years ago." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Inspector Warren's gaze sharpened. "And was that true?" There was a pause. Mrs. Harcourt did not answer at once. Then she said, "It was not as he described it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It seldom is," she said. "Inspector Warren said, but it was close enough to matter." "Yes, and that is why you acted." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes met his.
Yeah.
There was silence. Inspector Warren spoke carefully. "What did you do?" Mrs. Harcourt's hands remained steady at her sides. "I told him he was mistaken," she said, "that he had no right to bring such things here. He laughed. He said the truth has a way of finding its moment." Miss Marple's gaze remained gentle. "Yes," she said, "it does." Inspector Warren continued. "And 10?" He finished writing, Mrs. Harcourt said. "He set the paper down, and I read it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." "And you took it?" "Yes." Inspector Warren's voice was firm. "And Mr. Blake?" Mrs. Harcourt's expression changed slightly. "He stood up," she said, as though to stop me, or to say something more, but he did not. Miss Marple watched her closely. "No," she said softly. "He did not." Inspector Warren said. "He collapsed." "And—" "Yes, and you did nothing to cause that." "No." There was a pause. Miss Marple spoke gently. "No," she said. "She did not." Inspector Warren looked at her. "You are certain?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Important, because what happened to him did not come from her actions but from what he had already set in motion." There was silence. Mrs. Harcourt stood very still. "I took the paper," she said, "because it could not be allowed to remain." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "I understand," but in her mind the pattern was now complete. The meeting, the message, the recognition, and the decision, everything had followed naturally. Everything except one final thing, and that she knew must now be made clear. Important. Inspector Warren did not speak immediately after Mrs. Harcourt's account. He stood for a moment considering not only what had been said, but how it had been said. Then he glanced once more at the desk, as though the final shape of events might still be traced there. "The paper," he said at last. "You removed it?" "Yes." "And you still have it?" Mrs. Harcourt did not hesitate. "Yes." There was a quiet shift in the room. Inspector Warren held out his hand. "I must ask you to give it to me." For a moment it seemed she might refuse. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out a folded sheet. It was handled carefully, not with fear, but with a kind of controlled resolve. She placed it in his hand. Inspector Warren unfolded it and read. He did not speak the contents aloud, but his expression altered slightly, enough to confirm what Miss Marple had already understood. "Yes," he said quietly. "That would have been significant." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said. "Very." Inspector Warren looked at Mrs. Harcourt. "This refers to an incident some years ago," he said. "One that was not publicly known." "Yes." "And Mr. Blake intended to make it known." "I believe so." Inspector Warren nodded slowly. "And you wish to prevent that?" "Yes." There was a pause. Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is not the past itself that troubles us," she said. "Only the way it returns." Mrs. Harcourt did not reply. Inspector Warren continued. "And Mr. Blake's death, it was not caused by her," Miss Marple said quietly. Inspector Warren looked at her. "You are certain?" "Yes." She inclined her head slightly. "He was already under strain," she said. "He had come here with a purpose. Important. He expected resistance, perhaps confrontation. When it came one, the moment arrived it was enough." Inspector Warren considered this. "No struggle," he said. "No disorder." "Yes." "And the fall sudden?" "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly to the body. "He was not prevented," she said. "He was overcome." There was silence. Inspector Warren folded the paper again. "Even so," he said, "this document must be examined. There are implications beyond what has occurred here." Mr. Blake's intentions, Miss Marple thought, had not been trivial, nor had Mrs. Harcourt's decision. Inspector Warren turned to her once more. "You removed evidence," he said. "You interfered with the scene." "Yes, and you understand the seriousness of that." "I do." There was no defiance in her voice, no only acknowledgement. Inspector Warren nodded. "That matter will have to be addressed." "Oh." "Yes." The tension in the room eased slightly, though it did not disappear. Something had been resolved, but something else remained, quieter, more lasting. Miss Marple moved toward the window. Outside, the lawn lay as it had before, the chairs still arranged, the tea things undisturbed, the afternoon continuing as though nothing had altered. The village beyond remained composed, its rhythm unbroken. And yet she knew that something had shifted. Not in the visible order of things, but beneath it. The difficulty, she said softly, is that people believe the past can be left behind simply by not speaking of it. No one answered. But it is not so, she continued. It waits, and when it returns it does so with a certain clarity. Inspector Warren listened. And what people do in that moment, Miss Marple said, tells one everything. She turned back, her expression gentle. Mrs. Important. Harcourt did not act in panic, she said. She acted in certainty. She knew what the message meant and what it would bring. Inspector Warren inclined his head. Yes, he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And that is why the message mattered more than the moment itself. There was silence. Outside, a faint breeze stirred the leaves. Inside, the room had settled into a quiet stillness. The body remained. The truth, now spoken, lingered. And Miss Marple, gathering her gloves, reflected that while order would return as it always did, it would carry with it a knowledge that could not be undone. Because the silent witness, she thought, had not been in the room, nor the paper, but the human heart which remembered everything,